Hey everybody, Plushie here, and I feel like I say this every time, but after a very long wait, we're finally going to talk about Ciel. And she's certainly a very interesting addition into the game, not just because she is yet another Tsukihime rep, but also just because of how unique her entire gameplay kit is and how many different farming teams that she has actually spawned. So certainly a great topic to make a video on. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into today's FGO Hot Takes on Ciel. Taking a look at Ciel's base stats, honestly is nothing remarkable. She has slightly below average attack stat out of all SSRs, but that's just how moon cancers are. She actually is on slightly high end of all moon cancers, which is fair. She also has decent base MP gain, actually pretty nice, 0.46% per hit on a 4-hit arts card is really nice. She also has 5-hit quick cards and 6-hit extra attacks, so her cards that gain MP are decently good, but of course she comes with the negatives of most moon cancers. The low star weight, the mostly neutral class interactions really put Moon Cancer as one of the worst classes traditionally in the game. Ciel does have a passive that allows her to do 1.5 times damage against sabers, which kind of fixes the usually neutral problem, but still it's not a great class. And of course she has a BBAQ deck. Arguably, she might be a little bit better if she had a triple buster deck, as we'll see very clearly when talking about her skill set. But I guess this is fine, especially if you consider if she had a triple buster deck, her arts card would probably be stronger, so that might be just straight up better. But, BBAQ is fine for a character like her. Ciel's first skill is a really strong, basically perpetual effect that grants her all 5 turn effects. It gives her 10% MP per turn, it gives her 1.5k heals per turn, it also increases her debuff resistance by 50% for 5 turns, and finally it also increases her buff removal resist by 100% for 5 turns. And this skill only has a 6-turn cooldown, so essentially it only has 1 turn of downtime if you lure this, and this would be constantly up for this character. And this is obviously a very powerful sustain skill. It's a total of 7.5 thousand heal, and it actually totals up to even more when we take a look at her other stuff, such as her passives. Same goes with the debuff resist. 50% for 5 turns is already really strong, but especially when you combo that with some of her passives, as well as other units that are able to give her debuff resist up, such as Rhaenys or Asclepius, then she can essentially get infinite debuff immunity, which is of course very strong against certain bosses as well, such as Sir Nunos. And finally, she also has the highly coveted 5-turn buff removal resist by 100% on a 6-turn cooldown. So essentially, you can't buff removal her in most cases, especially if the servant is not like a special boss, it's just like an enemy servant. Most servants' buff removal effects are only 100%, so this is just going to prevent it completely. Very good against bosses that like to spam buff removal or have very critical break buff removal effects. So overall, I love this skill. Great for challenge quests, even though it has like 0 offensive utility. And this also helps her spam her MP better, which we'll see is a trend in her kit. Ciel's second skill is a bunch of effects, but it's actually not as complicated as it seems. It's a 3-turn Buster and Arts double buff by 30%. It also gives her on-attack effects on both her Buster and Arts cards. Whenever she attacks with her Arts cards, she casts a 3-turn 20% heal down on the enemy, and it also removes any Guts effects on the enemy. And finally, it also has a 30% chance to drain 1 MP gauge from the enemy. Whenever she attacks with her Buster card, it just gives her 10 MP, and this actually applies to her MP, so her MP gains 10 extra refund just from this skill effect. And finally, it also gives her a 3-turn critical damage steroid, which is 100% when she's at full HP, 50% when she's above 50% HP, and 0 if she's below 50% HP. So this live updates just like Tonalico's second skill. If you take damage after the first turn, the crit steroid drops down to 50%, and if you take even more damage, it might drop down to 0%. But if you heal up within a chain, then vice versa, it will, revert back to 100% or 50%, depending on how much you healed. So interesting dynamic on that last critical steroid part. In terms of all the other effects, the Buster and Arts double buff is just a pretty standard skill to slap onto any steroid. This is her only steroid for her MP damage though in her skill set, which kind of sucks. The card on attack effects for Arts is pretty niche. Heal down is almost always useless, and Guts removal is only useful against very certain bosses like Kamazots, who like to cast removable Guts multiple times in a fight. Most of the times they either only cast it like once, or it's just unremovable, or both. And finally, the charge drain effect is RNG. Like, it has very high potential. It can drain up to 6 gauges if you're soloing with her, but at the same time it can just drain like 1 or even none. So I don't really like relying on this a lot of the times, but if I'm in a pinch, I will spam my Arts cards to try to prevent enemies from hitting me with their MP. The Buster effect is more consistent and really nice. She gets to get her MP back even if she's doing a Buster Brave Chain with her MP, and this helps her loop her MP as well, even though she's Buster. And finally, the critical damage thing, you can actually consider whether you want to run Black Grill or not, because Black Grill's demerit triggers at the end of the turn after any heal effects, for example, her first skill. So in some cases, especially in farming, if you don't have additional healing effects, you will lose that critical damage up on her card by 50%, which is quite a bit. And there are certain cases where running a non-Black Grill CE that doesn't have a HP demerit would yield better total damage, which, I mean, we'll talk about it later, why her card damage is so important in farming. But as of now, you just want to know, for certain situations, Black Grill actually is not the optimal damaging CE for CL, which is really rare because that's like for basically every servant with a damaging MP. CL's third skill is arguably what defines her and makes her so unique. It sets your hand to her deck, so you have all of her cards for a single turn. And of course, after that one turn, the deck is reshuffled, so you don't run into problems where, oh, because I have all of CL's cards on turn 1, so on the turn 2 and turn 3, I wouldn't get any CL cards. No, they reshuffle the deck to prevent this from happening. The skill is also a 50 MP battery, and it gives her a 3x3 turn 100% defense up, as well as a 3x3 turn on defense effect, which triggers whenever CL takes a hit, which heals her for 2000 whenever she takes a hit. And all of this is on a 6-turn cooldown. So obviously, the first effects is extremely flashy. There are a lot of interesting combos you can do with this. You can use this, of course, for CL herself, just for a single turn of Big Burst. You can also combo this with Summer BB to lock her hand for 3 turns. Like, we've seen people try to do this with the Yu Olga Marie NPC, and now you can do this on an actual rollable servant. You can also, of course, use CL as sort of a support, where you lead her in the front line, and you click her third skill, and then you swap her out into another DPS you actually want to use, and of course the hand would become that DPS's hand, and then you can proceed to lock that with Summer BB as well for a lot of really interesting farming comps that we'll get into later. This skill is of course also a 50 MP battery. 50 MP batteries are always very strong, and it helps CL use her MP immediately very easily, and this is also a very defensive skill. Like, essentially what that third effect is just a 3x3 turn invul as well as a 6000 heal at the same time. So it's really strong. The heal is spread out as well, so you can potentially gain a lot out of it if you have like a heal boost CE and whatnot, and you don't always waste all of your heals all at once. You can sort of space them out depending on the enemy's action or whether you're taking hits or not. So just very strong overall skill. The first part, the battery plus the deck shuffle, is really good for farming, and the second part, which is the 100% defense up and the heal on hit effect, is really good for challenge quests in general, especially for soloing, because CL just gets her back to max HP whenever she activates the skill most of the time. So really, really strong, and we'll talk a lot about the implications of this once again later on. CL also has some really nice passives. She has Magic Resistance A, which gives her a passive 20% debuff resistance. It's especially strong when you combo that with her skill 1, which already gives her essentially permanent 50% debuff resist, so she gets basically permanent 70% debuff resistance, and it's extremely easy to bump that up to 100 against very debuff heavy bosses with someone like Rhaenys. She also has passive 12% crit up, which is really nice as an addition to her skill 2, especially when she doesn't have full HP. She also gets 500 passive heal per turn. Once again, pairs very well with her skill 1, essentially giving her a total of 2000 heal per turn permanently, which is very strong as a sustain effect in both, just normal challenge quests or especially solos. And finally, she also gains a 1.5 times pseudo class advantage against archers. This is very similar to Alter Ego Kiara being able to do 1.5 times damage to rulers. This gives her much better coverage than most Moon Cancers because, as I mentioned earlier, Moon Cancer is just kind of a shitty class that hits neutral most of the times. At the very least, CL can hit sabers 1.5 times as well. In terms of append skills, I would definitely recommend unlocking her append 5 once again, because in terms of buster looping, append 2 isn't that useful for a 50 MP charger. It's still very useful, especially if you want to use CL in like a multi-core setup with someone like Koyan Dark who has 30 spread charge, for example, but I definitely think append 5 takes precedence. And finally, CL's MP is a single target 12 hit buster MP that gives her a 1-turn sure hit as well as defense ignore. It also deals special effective anti-trade damage against demonic enemies. It also has a 100% chance to insta-kill, and it has a 20% MP flat recharge. And finally, the overcharge effect is a 30% MP damage up steroid for a single turn that scales all the way up to 60%. So the MP itself is pretty nice. It generates quite a decent amount of stars because it's a 12-hit buster MP, kind of like Herc's MP. It also gives her 1 turn of sure hit plus defense ignore. It's not as good as the combo of Invo Pierce and defense ignore, but it's still really nice to have. And of course, this comes in the form of a buff, so it extends to her face cards after her MP. And it's particularly important for CL because her card damage is a big part of her total damage. It also gives her super effective damage against demonic enemies, which are traditionally quite common amongst like non-servant mid bosses during 90++, so that's a really nice niche to have for farming. In some ways, I kind of would prefer Power Mod over SE, just because I also want this to apply to her face cards, just because of how face card centric her gameplay style is. But once again, having SE is less susceptible to be watered down by other buffs, because SE is like a completely separate buff type than anything else, unlike Power Mods. So I generally prefer SE anyways, so really nice to have. The insta-kill, of course, allows her to fit into certain insta-kill comps. I've definitely used her in the Blank Earth QP node, but honestly, I think we definitely have better options for that kind of stuff, like Shufu in the same banner, who has a whopping 175% insta-death chance compared to the meager 100%. So I think this is just a random effect that they tagged onto her, and it doesn't really affect her gameplay all that much. And finally, the 20% MP flat refund is really nice because she has a lot of flat like MP charge effects on her skill set. She has 10% MP at the end of each turn, as well as 10% MP whenever she attacks with her Buster card, which includes her MP. So when you total all 3 of these effects together, whenever she uses her MP, she is guaranteed to refund 40 MP, which is really powerful. Like some single target arts can't even do that with Double Castoria, and CL doesn't have to use any support to do that. And it also doesn't care about what enemy class you're fighting. So there are certainly a lot of farming comps involving CL herself looping her MP that heavily relies on this effect. And finally, the MP damage up steroid is pretty nice. 30% is a very generous number. This kind of effect is usually like 20% or even 15% if you're super stingy. But the 30% very much is to offset the lack of MP damage steroid in general in her skill set. She only has the 30% buster up in her skill set that actually buffs her MP damage. So especially in double Koyan light comps, her MP damage alone is going to be pretty doo-doo. But of course, we will include her face card because of that skill 3, and we'll get more into that discussion when talking about her farming. So before we actually get into the numbers and calculations for CL's farming, I want to go through a couple of basic points so that we can work through the numbers a little bit easier with these points established. The first point is CL doesn't need any of her cards to have enough MP gain to do 3-turn looping using Black Grail. And the reason behind that is what we mentioned a little bit earlier. You can just treat her as a servant that always refunds 40 MP static. So let's go through the numbers when you single core loop with Ciel. On the first turn, you start with 0, you use her 50 MP battery, and you use one of Koyan Light's 50 MP battery, and then you MP. On the second turn, she refunded 40 MP. Use the second Koyan Light's 50 MP battery on her, and she's at 90 MP. Give her 10 extra MP from an external source, and she can MP again. And on the final turn, her cooldown for her 50 MP battery will come back, and she also refunded 40 again from turn 2, so she's at 90 MP again. Supply her with another 10 extra MP charge, and she can MP once again. This is important because you can actually not always use Oberon for her, because all you need is 2 split 10 extra MP batteries. At minimum, you can use this Summer Mystic code that has 2 separate 10 extra MP batteries. Or, more importantly, you can also use Plug Merlin, because after Merlin's buff, he's able to give 20 on his first skill and 10 on his second skill. So use each one on turn 2 and turn 3 respectively, and you can do 3 turn loops. You might ask, well, why would I want to use Merlin over Oberon anyways? Especially after you just mentioned she doesn't need to use her face cards to do 3 turn looping. Well, she might not need to use her face cards, but she really wants to, because her MP damage alone is really potato, especially considering she's a Moon Cancer. Most of the time she's going to be hitting neutral, and even against Sabers with her passive, it's only a 1.5 times multiplier instead of the full counterclass 2.0. So she really wants to use her face cards to bolster her damage, especially for the final wave. This sort of brings us to our second point of, if you want to use Ciel as your main DPS in farming, double Koyan Light is basically mandatory. This mainly stems from the fact that Ciel is heavily reliant on her face cards for farming damage, and Koyan Light plays perfectly into that. First of all, Koyan Light has cooldown reduction, which allows Ciel to cast her skill 3 multiple times. This means that she can guarantee your hand to have all of her cards multiple times in one farming session instead of just one time. Second of all, Koyan Light specifically has Buster Star Absorb Up instead of a generic Star Absorb Up, which will help Ciel in her crit turns, because during her crit turns, she has all of her cards in your hand, so a generic Star Absorb Up would have done nothing. However, with Buster Star Absorb Up, this means that Ciel can gather all of the crit stars onto the maximum damage cards that she has during those turns to maximize her damage. And of course, Koyan Light's 20 Star Bomb also helps a lot in that situation. Her second skill's gain 10 MP on Buster attack effect also helps her in specific comps that involve Summer BB. And finally, healing also affects Ciel's damage, because Ciel's second skill gives her 100% crit up when she's at full HP, but only 50% crit up when she's not at full HP. And considering how face card damage dependent she is in terms of her farming, this is quite a big difference. Add on the fact that her best farming support, Koyan Sky of Light, has the ability to drain her HP by 1000 whenever she uses her first skill. This becomes quite the complicated issue. Luckily, the current best farming Mystic code does contain a heal. The new Plug Suit's second skill will heal the target by 3000 HP, which is enough to offset even 2 Koyan Sky of Light's skill 1 HP drain. However, you still have to be a little bit mindful in terms of when you pop the heal, depending on when you want your card damage to be maximized. The heal situation becomes the most complicated when you're using Black Grail on Ciel, because the 500 HP penalty you take from the Black Grail happens after the heal per turn effect from Ciel's skill 1 and passive. So essentially, at any given turn, you won't be at full HP with Ciel when you're using Black Grail, since even on turn 1, you are forced to use one of Koyan Light's battery to drain her HP. And this can be further broken down into 2 different situations. First of all, if you're doing Ciel double Koyan Light plug Oberon or Merlin, this means that you're only getting her face cards on turn 1 or turn 3, so I'm not considering her crit damage on turn 2. This means that if you want to maximize her damage on turn 1, you'll have to heal her after using Koyan Light's battery drain. But on the contrary, if you want to maximize your card damage on turn 3, you'll have to save the heal and heal her before doing your final damage on turn 3. The second situation is, of course, if you're doing double Koyan Light plug Summer BB. What you're doing with this is essentially guaranteeing CL's hand on all 3 turns during farming. Of course, this would make your decision a little bit harder because you can only have one of the turns have 100% crit up from her second skill. Depending on which turn you need to maximize your crit damage, you heal her on that turn. When CL's not using Black Grail, the situation becomes a little bit less complicated. Once again, if you're using CL, double Koyan Light, plug Oberon, or plug Merlin, you'd always heal her on turn 1. Because on turn 1, you'd be using Koyan Light's battery on CL, and you heal her back to full, so she has 100% crit up. On turn 2, you're forced to use a second Koyan Light's battery on CL, which will drain her HP to not full. But on turn 2, you can't guarantee your hand anyways with your face cards. So the crit damage isn't that big a deal. And by the third turn, CL would have healed back that 1000 HP from her passive heal per turn effect from her skill 1 and her passive. So she would have 100% crit up again on turn 3. So there's no decisions to be made if you're not running Black Grail and you're doing double Koyan Light plug Oberon. You just heal her on the first turn after you've drained her HP with Koyan Light's battery. Things gets a little bit more complicated once again when you decide to do plug Summer BB. Because with Summer BB, you're guaranteed CL's hand on all 3 different turns, so the previous argument of turn 2 card damage not mattering doesn't stand anymore. But you actually can still get 100% crit up on 3 different turns with Summer BB as long as you're not using a Black Grail. Because what you can do is you use both Koyan Light's drain on turn 1 and then heal your CL immediately. Well, you might ask, if I do that, wouldn't I be getting 150% MP charge on turn 1 because 50 from CL and 50 from each Koyan Light and wasting 50 MP charge? Well, yeah, you will be wasting 50 MP charge, but you can afford to do that because if you attack with your Buster cards, you can actually get MP back. CL's second skill will give you 10 MP whenever you use a Buster attack. And each Koyan Light skill 2 would also give you 10 extra MP whenever you attack with your Buster card. So with all 3 of these combined, whenever you attack with CL's Buster card, you get 30 MP. Assuming you're doing MP BB Brave Chain on turn 1, you get 40 MP from CL's MP alone, and then 30 MP from one of the Buster cards, and another 30 MP from the second Buster card. So you get a total of 100 MP after you enter turn 2. Meaning that you don't have to use the second Koyan Light's 50 battery for charge. You only use it for the 2-turn cooldown reduction. This means that if you use all of Koyan Light's skills, both of them, on CL on turn 1, after using all of CL's skills as well, and then healing her back to full, you will have 100% crit up on all 3 separate turns. This will fall apart in 2 situations though. The first situation is if there's only one enemy on turn 1 and your MP accidentally kills, and you don't get to use your face cards. And the second situation where this falls apart is if you want to do BMPB on turn 1 to kill 3 separate targets. Because if you do that, after your MP, you only get 1 extra Buster card, so you'll end at 70 MP on turn 2, meaning that you'll be 30 MP short. In those 2 situations, you'll have to do the same thing with Plug Oberon or Plug Merlin, where you give up on turn 2's crit damage, or you can also decide to give up on turn 1's crit damage and save the heal for turn 2. But both of these situations will at the very least guarantee 100% crit damage on turn 3. So here are the numbers that I came up with for CL, and I do believe CL is the best when doing single core looping with double Koyanskaya of Light, so these are going to mainly focus on that aspect of her farming damage. Now I did color code the chart so it's a little bit easier to read, and I will briefly explain what each category means. So there are three main comps that I'm considering for CL. We have Double Coin Light Plug Summer BB, which is a comp that focuses on allowing you to Brave Chain on all three waves, so you have better consistent damage, mainly for wave 2 to have better damage. Then we have Double Coin Light Plug Oberon, which is of course the comp that is going to be the most quote-unquote standard, which is going to focus on CL's MP damage and not so much her cards. And then finally, we will have Double Coin Light Plug Merlin, which is going to be the other comp that will focus more on her face card damage rather than fully going all in on her MP damage. So for black text, it's Plug BB. For purple text, it's Plug Oberon, and for red text, it's Plug Merlin. Now, you can also see that in these charts, the background of the numbers are in different colors, and the backgrounds determine what CEs I used in these comps. So for the black background, I used Black Grail, which is of course going to mainly be focusing on CL's MP damage. With the yellow background, I will mainly be focusing on using Golden Sumo, because I don't believe it's a very common thing for people to even have just one copy of Poster Girl, let alone an MLB version of it. So I'm only going to consider like the second best attack up CE in the game, which is of course Golden Sumo. Very accessible, you can just buy it in the Mana Prism shop right now. And then finally, the white background means that there's no CE present. And as you can see, we also have a smaller chart here with the red and blue background. And this chart is supposed to sort of be a loose reference. The red background is going to be the current hardest hitting single target DPS in the game, which is of course Kintoki Berserker. And he will be doing single core looping while using cranking. And the blue background would be the currently very powerful, I wouldn't say the most powerful, but one of the highest damaging single target arts farmers, which is of course Draco, and she would be using Black Grill and Double Castoria, Plug Oberon, both of these comps. So as you can see here on the first chart up top, these are CL's raw MP damage numbers. These are not damage numbers that are considering her face cards. And as you can see here, it's quite lackluster, even in the black background, parts, which is when she's using Black Grail. Compared to Kintoki, it's still not looking that great. Like, even though Kintoki is only using cranking, which is a considerably weaker CE than Black Grail, CL is still not doing great damage with her MP alone. You mainly focus on the Plug Oberon column, which is the purple one, I'd say, because if we're just looking at MP damage, this is probably the only viable comp. But of course, one of CL's greatest assets is her ability to guarantee her face cards, either on turn 1 and 3 or all 3 turns, depending on your comp. So we can move on to the second chart, which are the total damages that includes CL's face cards. And as you can see here, the numbers compared to Kintoki is a lot more impressive. So final two things to get out of the way is that this chart is calculated assuming you want to maximize crit damage, or total damage rather, on the final wave. So there are two things that you do in order to achieve that. So first and foremost, if you remember what we talked about a little bit earlier, in terms of Black Grill compositions, we are saving the healing until the last wave to maximize the crit damage. So if you do need more damage early on, you can obviously pop the heal a little bit earlier. And secondly, if you are using a Plug Merlin comp, we are in fact saving hero creation only to use on the final wave for that extra 100% crit up. Now, you are sacrificing 50% buster up for the first 2 waves if you do decide to do that. So if you do want to front load more damage, you also have the choice to do that as well. So there's obviously a lot of things that you can do in terms of calculating CL's damage, but in order to not make the video way too long, which at this point it probably already is, we are limiting to a couple of assumptions. And I do recommend the Chaldea app, which has a really good battle simulator that you can use. I did most of my calculations using that. If you really want to get into the specifics in terms of your personal CL comps. Now, there are a couple of interesting trends with CL's damage. So first and foremost, CL's total damage at lower MP levels is pretty much unbeatable. Because of the fact that you are including card damage, and your MP damage, as much as it grows, your card damage is going to stay the same. So the portion that it takes up in terms of your total damage is going to be higher when you're at lower MP levels. So CL is actually quite great if you really want a single target, single core looping option, but you don't really have the budget to pull for high MP levels. CL is actually able to provide you with really good damage, at least on wave 1 and wave 3 if you're not considering summer BB comps. Second of all, CL's damage performance is not that much worse when using a Golden Sumo CE, which is completely free, when compared to using an MLB Black Grail, which would not be the case for any other servant in the game, because once again, a large portion of CL's damage is actually focused on her cards and not just her MP damage. So if you also, lack an MLB Black Grail, Golden Sumo does actually provide a very similar level of damage. And of course, as we mentioned a bit earlier, for CEs that don't have a self-damaging penalty, you also have the advantage of being able to keep her crit damage at 100% for all 3 waves, instead of having to make a decision like with Black Grail. So as you can see here, on the first wave total damage portion, when you're using Golden Sumo, your damage at lower MP levels is actually better when you're using an MLB Black Grail, which is of course never going to be the case, not even close, for any other servant. Now, finally, another interesting trend is that you can see that Merlin actually performs very, very well in terms of as a Oberon replacement, because once again, a lot of your damage is focused on your face cards, and Merlin has the ability to supercharge your face cards, of course. Now, Merlin has this disadvantage of, if you're doing Plug Merlin, you can't guarantee your cards on the second turn anyways, so your MP damage is pretty crappy compared to the Oberon comp. And of course, on the first wave, you aren't really using any of Merlin's critical charges because you need to save both of his batteries from skill 1 and skill 2 for just MP charge purposes. So realistically, the difference only comes on the third wave in terms of Merlin versus Oberon. But as you can see here, even when you're using a Black Grail, which is supposed to be like Oberon's prime domain in terms of damage, Merlin comes extremely close, even at MP5. And at lower MP levels, Merlin actually beats out Oberon in terms of total damage. And, when you're using a non-MP centric CE like Golden Sumo, the numbers are even more in Merlin's favor. And in fact, even at MP5, Merlin is out-damaging, Plug Oberon. So usually I don't spend that much time talking about single core looping damage for a single target servant, because 111 looping is very not applicable. Like 111 90++ has only ever appeared 2 times in the span of 2 years. But of course, CL is a little bit different. CL can kill multiple targets in a wave with her farming, because of course she also has her face cards, and you can just space out her MP and her face card and take out multiple targets. And I will say, first and foremost, if you are aiming to take out 2 targets with CL, it's pretty decent. If you look at the numbers for raw MP damage and compare it to the total damage, you will see that the raw MP damage is usually about 50% of the total damage. So meaning half of CL's damage is going to be loaded into her face card. So if you're taking out 2 targets, you can dedicate half of your damage to one target, and the other half with the Buster extra attack to the other target. And of course, you can also do something more flexible. If you have 2 targets that are of differing HP levels, like one of them has significantly more HP, then you can of course do card MP and then Buster extra attack for the second smaller target. So I will say, if you are looping like generally 2 enemy waves, CL is still pretty good at it. But then, 3 enemy waves is a little bit more complicated. In terms of wave 1, I did actually look through all of the 90++ historically, and CL is pretty good at taking out 3 enemies on wave 1, because the HP levels on wave 1 is usually pretty low if there's 3 enemies. As you can see here, this very small chart at the bottom, this is the card damage for CL if we only consider double Koyan Light with no CE. And the first Buster card is going to be doing 62,000 damage if CL's not at full HP. And of course, you also have the choice to heal her to full HP with your Mystic Code, and it will be bumped up to 74,000. And this is with no CE once again, and even with no CE, this is basically higher than every HP for 3-wave wave 1s in terms of events that doesn't have damage bonus CEs. And if it's an event with damage bonus CEs, of course you're going to be doing a lot more damage if you equip her with the CEs. So I will say for wave 1 clears, if there's 3 enemies, CL can pretty comfortably kill all 3 of them. But problem starts to arise on wave 2 and wave 3. First and foremost, of course, CL might run out of damage for higher wave 2 and wave 3 HP targets. Second of all, unless you're using a plug summer BB comp, in terms of wave 2, CL can't even guarantee her face cards to kill another target. And finally, in terms of wave 2 and wave 3, the high HP target is actually often placed on the leftmost spot. And if you do try to do card MP card, you can never land your MP on the leftmost enemy. You either have to land your last Buster card on the leftmost enemy or your first Buster card on your leftmost enemy. So your highest concentrated source of damage is not going to be able to hit the highest HP target. So it's really inconsistent for wave 2 and wave 3 if you're trying to kill multiple enemies with CL, but for wave 1, it's quite easy. So if you click on the timestamp to skip all the way here, skipping all the number discussions, we have come up with a couple of conclusions after looking at CL's numbers. First and foremost, CL is a character that functions very well at extremely low MP levels, even at MP 1, because of how much of her damage is focused on her face cards. This pushes us to our second point of CL works very well with non-Black Rail CEs compared to other DPS units. This comes into play when either you are a free-to-play player, if you don't have a Black Rail, if you only have a non-MLB Black Rail, you can easily just purchase Golden Sumo from the Mana Prism shop and use that instead and yield similar or even better results in certain circumstances. And this also comes into play when you are using her in an event with a damage bonus CE, which will function more similarly to a Golden Sumo than a Black Rail, and of course you'll be yielding better results when using that compared to a Black Rail as well. Point number 3. Merlin is an extremely valuable tertiary support for CL, of course on top of Koyan Light, which is borderline mandatory, because he's able to give you really good burst damage, actually better burst damage if you're not using Black Grill compared to Oberon, and more flexible damage spreads because you can decide whether to use Hero Creation on CL on wave 1 or save it until wave 3, depending on the situation. So if you really want to main CL and you don't have Merlin, I highly recommend at least picking up one copy of Merlin in the future when he comes back. Point number 4, CL's single core looping is very interesting in the sense that she can actually take out multiple enemies in a single wave. However, that doesn't mean that you can comfortably farm 333 nodes with CL in most situations. She can pretty comfortably take out 2 enemies on wave 1 and wave 3, but if you do want to take out multiple enemies on wave 2, you might have to resort to a plug summer BB comp because you aren't guaranteed your face cards on turn 2 unless you have summer BB. And in terms of taking out multiple enemies in general, on wave 1, I will say it's pretty easy to kill 3 targets at once, but on wave 2 and wave 3, even if you have summer BB, it's very difficult to take out 3 waves because, number 1, the HP sort of just becomes out of range in terms of CL's damage, and number 2 is that the big HP target sometimes is placed on the leftmost position, which will disallow you to hit it with your MP if you decide to do Buster MP Buster for your chain. So once again, I will say the best number node for you to farm with CL is actually 311, so the devs are pretty smart to put that as the 90++ for her debut event. And finally, we have to talk about the biggest flaw for CL single core looping, and of course that is the inability to guarantee her hand on wave 2 unless you have summer BB. So you are either sacrificing massive amounts of damage on wave 2 and the ability to hit multiple targets, or you are sacrificing your third wave burst damage by a lot by including someone like Summer BB. And once again, Summer BB is sort of a niche support that not everyone is going to have, and I wouldn't say is required for you to use CL, but if you really want to single core CL more stuff, then I would say Summer BB is also pretty important. So after talking about CL single core for so long, we can get into a little bit about her multi-core performance as well as her supportive performance in farming. In terms of multi-core, it's a lot less flattering than her single core, mainly because she no longer has Koyan Light with her. Obviously, you can still run her with Koyan Light in certain multi-core setups, but I don't really consider comps such as Arash or Habertrot clear wave 1, and then CL comes in for the single core. That, in my opinion, is still a single core comp. In terms of multi-core, what I mean is more like, oh, you're just splashing them in to clear a single wave, such as Kintoki or the recently buffed Abigail. So those would be the units I'm going to compare with her, because those two are considered some of the best traitless, single target killers to splash into any multi-core team. So CL essentially would just be a 50 MP charger that would be able to do MPBB to a single enemy. And as you can see here in this small chart, the damage is a lot less flattering, of course, than her single core performance, because even at MP1, she is still losing to Kintoki, and she is basically on the same level as Abigail, which is of course still pretty impressive. Like, Abigail does pretty good damage after she got her buff, which gives her 100% power mod against terrorized enemies, which she can of course set by herself. But then, because CL lost her ability to crit, as the MP level increases, her damage slowly cannot catch up to some of the more staple units right now in the meta. And of course, when you compare CL to Abigail, Abigail also has party-wide support utility, while CL doesn't really have any. So overall, I wouldn't recommend, relying on her too much in multi-core. You can obviously use her even to clear multiple waves in multi-core, because she's still going to be refunding 40 MP after she MPs, so it's quite easy for her to MP multiple times in multi-core setups. However, because of her lackluster damage, and because if you're using her MP multiple times, she's not going to be able to guarantee her hand for one of the turns, and her damage is going to drastically fall off. Overall, I don't think she's very good at multi-coring at all. She's just a usable option, a standard 50 battery beat stick unit. And of course, finally, we can briefly go into the BB-CL comp. Of course, using CL as a pure support. Essentially, what you do is you lead with BB, Summer, CL, and a meta support of your choice, and then you use CL to set your entire hand into CL's card. You plug CL out for your main DPS, so now your hand is your DPS's hand, and then you lock your hand with Summer BB. With this kind of comp, you can basically try to spam MP card Brave Chains every turn to get your MP back easier by utilizing your card's natural gain, as well as do more damage to a single target with an AoE unit. Or if you just have a lower MP level single target unit, you can also try to eke out more damage by using a Brave Chain instead of just having to rely on your MP alone. So on paper, this certainly seems like a pretty good comp. However, in reality, I think this comp is very often more for fun than for practicality. So first and foremost, I think this comp is essentially worthless for Arts card type, because most of the times you can brute force loop with double Castoria plug Oberon anyways, and your damage is mostly focusing on your MP, so your cards aren't able to crit very easily. So overall, I think Arts would just never try to use this comp ever. As for Buster, it's very situational, very dependent on your DPS as well as enemy formation, because for Buster, you're kind of choosing between doing maximum damage versus getting maximum gains. If you want to do maximum damage, you're probably doing MPBB chains, but with MPBB chains, you're not getting much MP back from the entire Brave Chain, so you would not be able to loop your MP very easily in a 3-turn farming node. And on the contrary, if you decide to do like a Mighty Chain, for example, an MPQA chain, then you're not really doing much more damage than if you were just using your Buster MP, since you don't have any quick or art steroids tied to your meta support. And of course, you can do sort of a mixture of that, something like MPBA, for example, but that really depends on how good your arts gain is on your Buster Servant, for example. Maybe it works for someone like Eresh Kigal, but definitely doesn't work for most other Buster DPSs. And you're probably better off using a Buster looping comp. Since Buster looping comps already don't care about enemy numbers, you can brute force loop them as long as you do enough damage. And even though you have the possibility of using Black Grail with your BBCL comp by using Buster over cranking, you're missing out on so much damage by sacrificing the other Koyan Light and plug Oberon, because first and foremost, you're missing just another Koyan Light worth of buffs for the first 2 waves and another Oberon worth of buffs on the final wave, and also you're not double casting your DPS's steroids most of the case because you're missing on 2 turns of cooldown reduction. So overall for Buster, I also don't think this is a great idea. And of course, that leaves us with Quick. And I do believe Quick benefits the most for this kind of comp, since Quick uses Quick cards to gain their MP back, and their Quick cards are going to be buffed by their meta support, so there isn't a choice to be made like Buster where you have to choose between damage or gains. You always do MPQQ as much as possible. And Quick do have trouble brute force looping with their MP alone, since their MP's refunds are not nearly as great as Arts, so I can realistically see Quick using this comp over Triple Scotty in very certain circumstances. However, even with all that being said, I still find a couple of fatal flaws for this comp. First and foremost, you are missing out on a lot of MP damage, since you're cutting 2 Scotties or a Scotty and an Oberon for BB and CL, who has 0 party damage supportability. So if you're facing off against multiple enemies with similar amounts of HP, you might only be killing 1 of the enemies instead of all of them. And with that, even if you're only against like 2 enemies and you propose, maybe I can do Quick MP Quick, then you have to refund your full bar with just 1 Quick card and your MP's natural refund. And in some cases, that's not going to be enough. It really depends on how competent your Quick DPS actually is. The second problem actually is sort of the opposite side of the first problem, where you do so much damage with your MP, because mainly like if you're up against like 3 low HP enemies on wave 1 and you don't get the opportunity to use your face cards, you're not going to refund at all, since now you're only using 1 Scotty. Your Quick MP's refund is down the drain. So you actually have to not hit too hard with your MP as well with this kind of comp. So once again, if the first wave only has like very low HP enemies, this comp also automatically fails most of the time. And finally, let's say the first wave only has 1 enemy, 1 big HP enemy that will require you to crit with your Quick cards in order to kill alongside your MP. Well, you probably will have trouble critting with your Quick cards, since the 1 quick support you'll be using is going to be Summer Scotty, and when you're using Summer Scotty, she gives you Buster Star Absorb Up, so most of your stars from her Star Bomb is going to be gathered onto your DPS's Buster cards instead of your Quick cards, so you will have a lot of trouble critting, and you can't even switch to normal Scotty for this, since normal Scotty just straight up doesn't have a Star Bomb, so it's literally even worse. So in conclusion, I think this comp is very situational. There's definitely situations where the stars align, where your DPS is competent, and you also have the perfect number of enemies with the perfect HP numbers in your 90++, and this comp would seem very, very strong. But there's going to be equal, if not more, situations where this comp just straight up doesn't work at all. Now, I won't completely discredit this comp. There are a couple of cool things that this comp will allow that other comps would not. First and foremost is, of course, lower MP level DPSs will have more leniency working with this comp. It's a very similar logic to the Ciel argument, where a lot of her damage is going to be focused on the face card instead of just solely on the MP. And the second coolest part that I like about this comp is, of course, the implementation of command codes into your farming routine. So you can come up with very unique stuff, such as using the Merlin command code for a bit of extra gain, or using specific anti-trait command codes to push even more damage. And this also allows Append 1 to actually show some sort of use in farming, which traditionally is not going to be the case. So I definitely like this whole implementing phase cards into your farming idea, because I really like the attack animations in this game. So having the ability to watch this to play out is something that I personally really like. But once again, I have to say this is a more entertaining sort of comp over the traditional, more reliable double meta support plug Oberon system comps. Finally, we're done talking about Ciel's farming, and we can go into her challenge quest performance. So in terms of challenge quest performance, she is insane defensively. Her first skill gives her essentially permanent buff removal resist, as well as 70% debuff resistance when combined with her passive, as well as 2k heal per turn permanently when combined with her passive. So you basically don't have to bring any specific healer or counters to enemy gimmicks such as buff removal or debuff spam. She can just ignore most of them by herself. Her third skill, of course, also gives her essentially a 3-hit invul that ignores invul pierce, since it's actually a defense up that also heals her whenever she takes a hit, essentially healing her by 50% of her HP most of the time when she pops it in total. So defensively, she is nigh untouchable in my opinion. Offensively, she can ignore a lot of enemy gimmicks as well. Mainly, her second skill's ability to remove any guts when attacking with her arts cards, as well as the chance to drain enemy MP. The drain is not very consistent, but if you spam it enough, you can really delay the enemy's MP turn by quite a bit. And her MP, of course, has the really good combo of sure hit and ignore defense, so that also allows her to ignore a lot of the enemy's gimmicks. And of course, Ciel also has a really spammable MP, one of the most spammable Buster single target MPs in the entire game, because it base refunds 40 MP. That's better than some arts single target units when you don't consider face cards. So Ciel is really good on that front as well. She even has a 100% critical damage steroid as long as she's not using a Black Grail essentially, and she's going to be at full HP very often, so that also boosts her face card damage by quite a bit. So far it's all just insanely powerful. So is Ciel the most broken single target boss killer in the game? No. And the one weakness she has in terms of boss killing is, of course, her damage. So yeah, despite her ability to have the 100% crit up steroid on her second skill, she actually has quite a lot of trouble critting when she doesn't have the buffs from someone like Koyan Light, because she is a Moon Cancer, which has really low star weight for absolutely no reason. She's also going to be hitting neutral most of the time, and even when she's hitting sabers with her passive, she's only dealing 1.5 times damage, so it's not nearly as great as just using an archer. And finally, her MP damage, just like when we talked about when talking about her farming, is really puny compared to most other single target DPSs, especially ones with MP upgrades. And the one thing she uses to offset that crappy MP damage in farming, which is of course setting your hand to her deck, is a lot less relevant in challenge quests when the fight drags beyond 3 turns. Because yes, in farming you are setting your hand at the minimum for 2 out of 3 turns. In a challenge quest, after the initial 3 turns, you're not going to be able to set your hand nearly as often as possible. You're essentially going to be able to set it every 6 turns, and For the rest of the 5 turns each cycle, you're going to be doing mediocre damage with Ciel compared to every other Buster single target DPS. And once again, in challenge quests, it's not that relevant to have all of your cards all at once because you have the opportunity to use all of them anyways across 3 turns since the fight is dragged on for so long. So my personal experience with Ciel is she is very polarizing because the rest of her kit screams a sustained slow burn DPS while her main deck setting gimmick screams hyper offense TA DPS. So I'm either doing double coin light plug Merlin and treating the boss as a farming node, and then I feel really sad after I run out of gas, or I'm just taking the L and just using a slow burn team with something like Merlin, and then just accept the fact that she's not going to be doing great damage with her MP overall, and the fight would be dragged on for even longer, which is honestly kind of fine since she can definitely live a lot longer than a lot of other single target DPSs. It's just that she's not going to feel nearly as impressive as her single core farming. And finally, we can talk a little bit about her solo potential. And after such a long time, I can confidently tell you I definitely overrated her on week 1. So Ciel feels like this infinite heal tank that could never be killed that can also spam her MP very easily. Of course, that sounds really broken, but Ciel actually doesn't have infinite amount of sustain as opposed to some other solo unit such as Summer Bavanshi who can literally go infinite, nor does she have enough hard DPS as someone such as Tyra who definitely doesn't have a lot of sustain, but during her time when she's alive and living enemy hits with her guts, she's able to push out a lot more damage than Ciel. So she's sort of stuck in these very awkward situations. The reason why I thought she was so good initially was because I was pitting her against very low pressure bosses, such as Kamazotz, who has class disadvantage against Ciel, or Demonic Bodhisattva, who just has really crap damage overall. Ciel's damage issue is perhaps the most showing in her solos because the one tool that she always uses to offset her lackluster MP damage is to set your hand to her deck, which is completely pointless in a solo because everybody constantly has their hand as their deck. And when everyone's super, then no one is. So Ciel essentially loses her greatest damage boost in her kit, and that really sucks because now she's forced to be this low DPS single target solo unit while not having permanent sustain. Now, it does seem like I am slandering her quite a bit. I'm not discrediting all the good stuff about her, and I do think you really have to pick your fights when you try to solo with Ciel. Any bosses that are severely reliant on any of the gimmicks that she can ignore, such as buff removal, guts, spamming debuffs, and whatnot, Ciel will do really good against. Or you can just pit her against a demonic enemy, then she won't have lackluster damage anymore because, as a reminder, her MP has anti-demonic, so, you know, it's pretty good. It's a quite common anti-trait as well. In conclusion, I think Ciel is a character that you won't ever struggle to find a use for if you do decide to pull for her, even just at MP1. She of course can serve as arguably the most flexible single target Buster Looper in the game, considering she has the ability to run no starting charge CE, as well as take out multiple enemies in a single wave. Ciel also works very well at low MP levels because a large portion of her total damage is tied to her face cards instead of just tied to her MP in terms of farming. Ciel of course can also combo with Summer BB to enable more face card centric farming strategies. Even though I don't think the comp is always going to be very practical, it at the very least is a little bit more viable than just a meme, and for particular characters, especially quick AoEs at lower MP levels, I can definitely see this working out very well in certain 90++ nodes. For players who don't have a lot of premium options such as MLB Black Grill or Oberon, I think all you realistically need is a Koyan Light for Ciel to perform very decently, because once again, she's not all in on MP damage, so free CEs such as Golden Sumo and supports that are more face card buffing centric such as Waver can serve as great substitutes. However, on the flip side, if you're a person who has a very stacked roster, for example, if you have more niche supports such as Summer BB, Ciel's potential also grows exponentially. However, with all that being said, I do feel like if you already have a pre-established system for all of your farming and challenge quest needs, Ciel doesn't really feel necessary at all. None of the things that she provides, in my opinion, are at the upper echelon of practicality. It's more so entertaining than good. So if you do want to save your Saint course for potentially future audio call to characters, for example, I think it's absolutely fine to skip her. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this video. I apologize for how long this took. This has been a huge undertaking, and once again, thank you guys for being so patient, and I'll see you guys in the next one.